All right, Proposition 65, we have Ashley Ames, who's going to talk about the disposable bag solo.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. So at a high level, what Proposition 65 does is it requires that the revenue from bag sales under any state law that requires bag sales and that also bans some other types of bags, that revenue will be deposited into a new state fund, which the proposition creates and would be used to support environmental grants. But to understand kind of what that means, I think you need a little bit of context. The legislature recently passed and the governor did sign a state carryout bag law, which is commonly known as SB 270. SB 270 prohibits most grocery, convenience, and liquor stores, as well as larger pharmacies, from providing single-use plastic bags at checkout. It also generally requires that if those stores choose to provide recyclable paper bags or reusable bags, that they charge at least 10 cents for those. SB 270 does allow the stores that sell those bags to retain the revenue, and it specifies that the money from those sales must be used for costs that are associated with compliance with the law, the actual costs of the bags themselves, and educational materials or educational campaigns that encourage recycling. So notably, SB 270 is not currently in effect because there's a referendum on that law that also will appear on the ballot. And so it's unclear whether 270 will go into effect or not. We'll get to that momentarily. For now, just assume that 270 would be upheld and that this measure, Proposition 65, related to the revenue, would go into effect. And we'll talk about what those effects would be. So based on the provisions of 270, it seems like this would likely apply to it. If so, any revenue from the sales of the bags that I mentioned, recyclable paper or reusable bags, would go into the new state fund that's created rather than be retained by the retailers. That fund would be used to support grants that would go to several programs and projects related to different environmental causes, which include drought mitigation, recycling, water, parks, beach cleanup, litter removal, and wildlife habitat restoration. The measure does allow a small portion of the revenue to be used for the grant administration and for audits of program participants. Finally, it's important to note that it would not apply to local laws that are already in effect. It only applies to the statewide law. So if you live in a local area that already has a law, revenue from the sales could continue to be retained by stores or used for other purposes. But this measure does provide local governments with the option to opt into the state fund if they chose to do so. So in terms of fiscal effects, the main effect of the measure would be redirecting the revenue from bag sales from stores to the state. And we estimate that could be in the several tens of millions of dollars annually. And the actual amount could be higher or lower. A lot of it depends on what the actual future bag sales are and what the prices are. So, of course, going back to what I said earlier, this assumes that 270 is upheld and goes into place, and it assumes that this measure goes into effect. For that to happen, 270, the Prop 67, must pass, this measure must pass, and this measure must receive more votes. So to explain that, because there are two measures on the ballot, they're both related to carry-out bags, the same subject, and you're voting on them at the same time, they can potentially affect each other if they both pass, and then whichever one receives more votes will be the one that goes into effect. So because 270 specifies that stores can retain the money, but this measure specifies that they go into the fund, it just depends on which measure receives more yes votes, whether the money goes to the fund or is retained by the stores. And so we do have a figure, I think that's up here, yeah, that is included in your voter guide as well. And so that scenario would be in the top left corner of the figure. Under the different scenarios, for example, if the referendum on SB 270 fails, but this measure does pass, there would not currently be a statewide law that this measure would apply to. So currently, it would only affect local governments that chose to opt in. However, it would remain on the books. And so if there's a future law that meets these requirements, it potentially could require revenue from bag sales under the future law to be deposited into this fund. And then in the bottom row, obviously, if this proposition fails, there would be no effect.
Okay, so in support, the Republican Party of California, opposition, Libertarian Party, Peace and Freedom Party, and other Democratic organizations. Opposition is League of Women Voters, Clean Water, and Surfrider, which is a Clean Water at the Beach organization. Public officials, just a few on either side. And then in opposition, we have several newspapers, none in favor. And then the money is very lopsided on this, but that's because there are two measures in opposition to each other. So there's a little over $6 million in favor of it from plastic bag companies. Okay. And then nobody's spending against because they're spending on the other measure. All right, Prop 67.
Yes, so Prop 67, I already covered several of the requirements of that, such as the prohibition on single-use plastic bags and the charge. Beyond the provisions that I already mentioned, it does also create standards for reusable bags, such as durability requirements and thickness requirements, and it requires that the Department of Resources and Recycling, CalRecycle, would have to certify that reusable bags that are sold met those standards. It's also similar to many local laws that are already in effect. As I mentioned, there are about 150 of those. They currently cover about 40% of the population in California, and so this measure would only apply to the 60% not currently covered. And so it does not replace the laws that were already in effect. For the fiscal effects with this, we estimate they'd be relatively small. The cost to CalRecycle of certifying the reusable bags would be less than $1 million annually. There could be some other minor fiscal effects, for example, savings for litter cleanup for local governments. But once again, there's the interaction between this and Proposition 65. And so if this and the revenue initiative go into effect together, it'd be similar types of effects as I described before. If this has more votes, then the money would go to the retailers, as this specifies. If 65 has more votes, then this would largely probably go into effect, but with the revenue going elsewhere. And then obviously, if Proposition 67 fails, there would not be in effect.
All right, endorsements, the Democratic Party, Green Party, Peace and Freedom, and other Democratic organizations are in support of this one. The Libertarian Party is opposed. In support, we have Fish and Game, Conservation Voters, CalPERG, League of Women Voters of California, NAACP, Natural Resources Defense Council, Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, Trout Unlimited, a bunch of environmental organizations, Cliff Bar, Patagonia, Mountain Hardware, so like outdoorsy clothing organizations too, and Cliff Bars. And then in opposition, we have the American Forest and Paper Association, the BAG Alliance, Forest Products, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, Teamsters, etc. The Dow Chemical Company is opposed to this one. And then endorsements, we have the governor, lieutenant governor, a bunch of elected officials all over the board. And then in support, most of the newspapers are in support. And the spending is lopsided in the other direction on this. The no side, 6 million plus. The yes side, 1.5 million almost. So we have grocers on the yes because they don't get the funds anymore. On the no, we have the bag companies, again, on the no. Questions on these two? Yes. Can we get the microphone over here?
If both measures pass, are single-use plastic bags still allowed to be sold by the stores, although the money would go out of the store?
Well, if both measures passed, it probably ultimately would be a question for the courts exactly how they would be implemented, but we felt that it was likely that most provisions of 270 would go into effect, which would include prohibiting single-use plastic bags from the stores that are specified. Now, for the revenue to be redirected, Proposition 65, the initiative on the revenue from the bag charges, would need to get more votes, and then the prohibition would likely still be in place, and the revenue from the sales would likely be directed to the state.
Okay, woohoo, we made it. Thank you. If we could get you to fill out those post surveys, we want to understand how effective these kinds of things are. I want to thank Hannibal's for the beautiful catering, and the PI interns and Sac State graduate students for all the work they did tonight as well. If you could give them a hand. And also, of course, the Legislative Analyst's Office. That was fantastic.